On July 14th, the enraged insurgents made their way to the towering Bastille prison. They did not know it yet, but in a little over 6 hours, the fortress would fall. Armed with pickaxes, pitchforks, axes, knives, as well as thousands of rifles stolen that morning at the Hôtel des Invalides, a flood of people reaches the Bastille. But these insurgents are by no means seasoned rioters.
Most of the people live very close to the Bastille, in fact. So they are ordinary people. They're not, generally speaking, bourgeois or anything like that. They're artisans of one sort or another, small craftsmen, the sort of people who later on would become the sans-culottes, but that's who they are.
Their sole aim at 10:30 a.m. on July 14th is to find powder and shot for their arms. And they know the Bastille now has 20,000 cartridges and 250 barrels of gunpowder stored in its basement. In fact, in this city that has been seething with unrest for days now, the building's security has been strengthened. For the artillery, 15 cannons have been mounted in the embrasures of the towers. They are pointed at the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the quarter adjacent to the prison. 3 more cannons have been installed in the main courtyard facing the entrance. And 12 wall guns firing 1.5-pound shots complete their arsenal. But that isn't all. The garrison guarding the Bastille has been reinforced too. Ordinarily, only 100 or so guards, known as the Invalides, protect the prison.
The Invalides were old soldiers, veteran soldiers, who after participating in military campaigns were posted to guard this and other castles. They were capable of fighting and defending themselves, but were no longer fit for active service in an army or on the battlefield.
This was a problem, because on the 14th of July, 1789, the Place de la Bastille would take on the appearance of a battlefield. So the radical decision was taken to bring in foreign soldiers, Swiss Guards, an elite corps with a red and yellow uniform. They were only 32 in all, but their presence caused alarm among the rioters.
These soldiers did not know the local population well. They came from abroad and would not hesitate to shoot, so they were more loyal when it came to cracking down.
It looks as if the Bastille will be able to deal with what is nothing more than a riot. The problem is, it is in the hands of a governor who does not have the makings of a commander. Inside the Bastille, 6 hours before the attack, a man keeps looking through the arrow slits at the crowd gathering outside the fortress. He seems incredibly anxious. This is the Marquis de Launay. He is 49 years old and the governor of the Bastille.
He was a fearful, worried man. According to one account of him, at night, he often mistook the shadows of trees for enemies. He was very anxious.
De Launay was an insider born in the Bastille. His father had served as governor, so that's all he knew. And that was another problem. As everyone knows, when you're only familiar with one structure, you cannot understand the rest.
Another problem for the governor, commanding the new foreign soldiers.
It was very difficult maybe to make decisions, especially in a situation where he had commanded the Swiss, whom he didn't know, who were not used to obeying him, who didn't work in the same way.
But most importantly, de Launay had very little military experience, and this would prove fatal.
As a bureaucrat and administrator, and never having had a military position, de Launay was definitely not the man for the job.
So how will he handle these rioters, who for now are just demanding powder? The solution could well come from these men making their way through the crowd. They are representatives of the people.
Their job is to suppress violence, in effect, to avoid violence, and that's what the first delegation is intended to do. Launay, he didn't even feel threatened, I think, very much to start with, because when the first delegation comes from the Hôtel de Ville, he invites them to eat with him. They have lunch with him.
For the governor, supplying powder and shot is out of the question. But he does not appear to have any aggressive intentions.
The governor de Launay even promises them he will withdraw the cannons and not fire at the crowd. He offers assurances, and he has the cannons moved. But ironically, this is what creates a misunderstanding.
They suddenly see the cannon being drawn back and they think, they're loading them in order to fire them. They're not, in fact. They're withdrawing because they were asked to withdraw them. And the governor actually puts wooden boards in front of the embrasures where the cannon would be. But, you know, the wrong impression is given by that. And it's fatal misunderstandings.
If the crowd gathered outside the Bastille feels threatened and imagines the worst, it's because this fortress is loathed and feared by the Parisians. The Bastille is situated in central Paris, at the end of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, a working-class district home to many craftsmen and workers. The residents see this imposing behemoth day in, day out. And it is impossible to forget that inside these menacing towers, a stone's throw away, men are imprisoned.
Over the years, the city grew and surrounded the Bastille. Pictures of that time show this huge carbuncle, this towering fortress, with houses built up against it. So they could hear the screams.
From time to time, prisoners would shout through the barred windows, so naturally, people wondered what was going on in there, what horrible things were happening.
And nobody outside knows anything about it. It's a secret prison in that sense. So you get this great big lowering fortress, in fact, and what's going on in there, we don't know.
If this prison was so secret, it's because its dungeons were full of prisoners who had been thrown in without trial on the king's say-so. The sovereign simply issued what is known as a lettre de cachet.
This was a letter issued by the king's office authorizing the imprisonment of an individual without trial, without any justification whatsoever. The individual imprisoned could be a gruesome killer, but the king did not have to justify his decision. So it was arbitrary, the exercise of arbitrary royal power.
Inside the prison were 40 4-by-5-meter cells. Up to 100 prisoners could be held in them. There was a culture of secrecy here. No information could get out.
There was a cloak of anonymity around the individuals imprisoned in the Bastille. They were taken to the prison in carriages with curtains that hid them from view. People did not necessarily know the reason for their imprisonment or the length of their detention.
So obviously, with all this secrecy, the Parisians imagined the worst. The Bastille was seen as a tomb in which you could be buried alive.
In fact, the Parisians imagined it a bit like an ogre, a belly that ate people. Because once you entered it, you didn't really know what would happen.
It was silence. It was secrecy. It was hell. The Bastille was said to be a living hell.
It is with this image in mind that on the morning of July 14th, 1789, the insurgents rose up outside the Bastille, a building they hated and feared. 5.5 hours before the fortress is stormed, in the prison governor's office, the representatives of the people are still trying to broker a peaceful outcome with de Launay. They have been at the table for an hour already. Lunch drags on and on. Down below, the crowd cannot understand why the delegation has not come back out. The insurgents lose faith. They grow impatient, and the myth of this prison of horrors takes hold.
Meanwhile, and it happens very quickly because it's by word of mouth, the rumor spreads that the rioters are being held prisoner, that they're being killed, and that de Launay is a criminal.
So, a second delegation is sent. Again, de Launay assures them of his peaceful intentions. His promise is clear.
Launay sends out the message that he will not fire unless he is attacked.
But the crowd is too excited to be reassured. Their anger grows. Slogans are bandied about.
It's like a pressure cooker outside the Bastille. And this is when the tension escalates.
The mob surges forward as far as the first drawbridge. Their sole objective now is to bring it down. But what they don't know is, it could prove much easier than they think. The assailants are unaware that there is no one behind this entrance. Not a single armed guard. The fact is that de Launay, lacking any military experience, had not foreseen the situation.
De Launay made a grave error when he felt threatened by the mob. He withdrew all his men into the castle, leaving the two drawbridges leading to the outer courtyard undefended. He put no one on the bastion. All the guards were inside the fortress.
And the situation spiraled out of control. It definitely wasn't planned.
5 hours before the Bastille is stormed, the invalids shout desperately at the crowd to move away from the drawbridges and wave their hats to attract their attention.
People don't know what that means. Is this a signal for attack? And so on. And again, that problem of misunderstanding of what's going on.
There was a lack of understanding, a mutual lack of understanding between those who ran the fortress and the Parisians who lived right next door to it. This inability to understand one another might seem unimportant, but it essentially means that structurally these two spaces never communicated. They did not understand each other, and there was a complete absence of trust between the two.
This misunderstanding exacerbates the rioters' anger. They have been positioned outside the Bastille for 3 hours now. Their objective is to bring down the first drawbridge. This attack will be the point of no return. 3.5 hours before the people's victory, the riot takes a new turn.
A group of insurgents immediately climbed onto the roof of a perfumery, jumped down into the governor's courtyard, and broke the chains on the drawbridge. And the mob surged into the fortress.
Shots are fired, and the first victims fall. But who fired first? The besieged or the rioters?
I don't think we'll ever know for sure. I suspect the defenders fired the first shots because they feared for their lives. You have to imagine this huge crowd around the prison of at least 10,000 people, which was becoming increasingly threatening, and facing them a handful of defenders. So I think it's perfectly plausible that the besieged fired first when the situation turned dangerous.
As the bodies continued to fall, the rumor went around that de Launay had drawn the crowd into a trap. He had let the rioters into the courtyard to make it easier to shoot them from the top of the towers. But we don't know this for sure either. At 2:30 p.m., the fighting has been going on for an hour. On top of the towers, the soldiers continue firing. The rioters are not out of the woods yet. To get inside the Bastille, they have to make it over the moat and lower a second drawbridge. In the shower of bullets, it is impossible to advance without cover, so the rioters wheel in 2 wagons of straw and set them alight. It's a military tactic. The smoke enables them to get closer without coming under direct fire. The insurgents are determined. They will not leave here until they have taken the Bastille. The tension is at its height. Nothing can stop them now.
When they were fired upon, it's as if the first shot brought all their negative perceptions of the Bastille to the fore in a split second. And as a result of this, they wanted to take the Bastille, because taking the Bastille would make the people sovereign. In other words, we're in control. We have control, and we are the strongest.
The problem is, the rioters do not have what it takes to overcome this fortress. They have no military experience. They cannot break through the prison's thick stone walls with the weapons they have, and most importantly, they have no leader. But all of a sudden, the fighting, which has been chaotic so far, changes. At 3:30 p.m. on the 14th of July, just 90 minutes before the Bastille falls, a horde of French guards turns up outside the prison. You might think the king has sent reinforcements to Launay to quash the revolt. Except they are led by a revolutionary. Few people today have heard of him, but this man played a decisive role in the storming of the Bastille. His name is Pierre-Augustin Hulin. A 31-year-old former sergeant and now a laundry owner, he is devoted to the revolutionary cause. But how come an insurgent was commanding the king's troops outside the Bastille that afternoon? In fact, Hulin managed to persuade Louis XVI's troops to change sides.
Hulin convinces them that if they don't come to the people's aid, then there will be a massacre. These French guards know the local population. They don't want to shoot them and are well aware of the people's suffering, so they end up deciding to join in.
They felt solidarity with their brothers, their cousins. Even though they had no blood ties, they were connected through the city. There was this territorial dimension. This is our city.
This turnaround changes everything. For the Faubourg Saint-Antoine's simple rioters, these soldiers provide crucial backup.
They turned up with weapons and with their military training. In other words, they were people with combat experience, and they were able to make decisions quickly.
If it hadn't have been for the defection of those royal troops on July the 14th, 1789, the insurgents would never have got into the Bastille. The revolt would have been suppressed.
Dieser Sturm auf die Bastille wäre niedergeschlagen worden.
The insurgents set up 2 cannons in the governor's courtyard, facing the wooden deck of the drawbridge immediately outside the Bastille's main entrance. It looks as if the rioters are going to pull it off, but they have not won yet.
What they didn't know was that the Swiss guards had come down and concentrated their artillery behind the drawbridge. It would have been a massacre, because they would have shot the insurgents practically at point-blank range.
Governor de Launay is faced with a crucial decision. Either he attacks, but he is well aware it will cause a bloodbath, or he surrenders. The problem is, de Launay has no idea what to do.
We need to look at things from de Launay's perspective. De Launay is awaiting orders, which is normal. He's the governor of the Bastille. It's not for him to decide, and he needed reinforcements. The Paris lieutenant of police was supposed to provide backup, but the lieutenant of police did not give him any instructions. The king's office, the court of Versailles, didn't either.
That point that Launay says, I can't do anything else, I can't defend this any longer, they will get in one way or another.
Half an hour before the Bastille falls, the garrison waves a white flag in an attempt to stop the angry mob firing. Cornered, de Launay sees no way out. He knows the next few minutes will be crucial. This is the decisive moment. In an act of suicidal desperation, de Launay takes up his quill. This is what he writes in his message.
We have 20,000 pounds of powder. We will blow up the fort, the garrison, and the whole quarter if you do not accept our surrender.
Someone later quipped, Monsieur de Launay lost his head before it was cut off. He panicked because he was already panic-stricken the previous day and the day before that. He has no experience of sieges, and so feeling pushed to the wall, he threatens to blow everything up.
De Launay asks the commander of the Swiss Guards to give the message to the besiegers. But how can he when the mob is on the other side of the drawbridge? It's an extraordinary story.
The message is pushed through a gap in the drawbridge's wooden deck. So they see this piece of white paper appear, and to retrieve it, they have to reach over the moat.
The insurgents use a plank of wood. One of the insurgents gets up on the plank. Another falls and injures himself.
Then another, and they finally manage to retrieve this letter threatening to blow everything up.
But the mob's answer was unequivocal. Surrender refused.
Why? Because they want to get revenge for de Launay's betrayal. There is no question of de Launay and the invalids marching out with the honors of war. They want revenge.
This desire for revenge would shape the outcome of the storming of the Bastille. At 5 p.m., the drawbridge is suddenly lowered. We don't know if this decision came from the invalids or from Governor de Launay himself. In a mad scramble, the besiegers sweep into the prison and seize the garrison. Some grab weapons and powder.
The insurgents had the impression that they were entering the belly of the beast of absolute monarchy, entering something terrible and seeing at last.
Others set about ransacking the building and throwing records out of the window as if they wanted to eliminate the symbols of this loathed place as quickly as possible. All that remains to be done is search the prison from top to bottom to free the supposedly many inmates. In the excitement of their victory, this proves complicated. First problem, no one can find the keys to the cells.
As the keys to the cells had been taken by the rioters and brandished in the streets of Paris, I've got the keys to the Bastille. They had real trouble opening the prisoners' cells.
Second surprise, and a big one too, they only find 7 inmates. In fact, in recent years, the number of incarcerations had plummeted, but the people had no way of knowing that. They were also unaware that this prison was far from being the chamber of horrors they had imagined. For the wealthiest, the Bastille even had VIP apartments.
It was a 4-star prison, a luxury hotel even, if you were a high-ranking noble or a blood prince. You were allowed to bring your servant and have your wife visit you.
Spacious bedrooms, the possibility of hiring the services of a barber to have your hair done in your cell. And every meal was like a feast. 5 courses for lunch, 3 for dinner.
It just shows you that there's hospitality in the Bastille, rather than people languishing, chained in dungeons and so on.
But for the poorest, life was much harder. So where did these false rumors come from? Many philosophers and writers were imprisoned in the Bastille at one time or another. Among them Voltaire and the Marquis de Sade. The king accused them of distributing banned works. Thanks to their imprisonment, they found a great way to attract publicity, even if it meant painting a bleak picture of prison life.
They're writing bestsellers, they're writing sensational works, works that will sell. It's mysterious and it's threatening. It seems the sort of thing that would go on inside a fortress of that sort and so on, but they do it for the money.
Sometimes sold all over Europe, these works meant the royal prison was soon seen as a citadel of nightmares, when in fact, the reality was quite different. No matter. To preserve the idea that it was a terrible prison, an eighth prisoner was invented, the Count de Lorge, an old man who had apparently been locked up in the Bastille in appalling conditions for 32 years. Books were even written about this fictional character.
It's a total invention. It's what we call fake news, if you like, nowadays. But you know, they need to have someone who has really suffered to legitimize, in some ways, the attack on the Bastille. And people believe it. I mean, it's extraordinary.
By late afternoon on July 14th, the mob's anger has reached fever pitch. The defenders of the Bastille now know the people's vengeance will be terrible.
By that time, 100 people have been killed among the crowd, and it's this, the feeling that the defenders of the Bastille have in fact murdered all these insurgents, that really increases the fury of the people who take the citadel.
The man most in danger is, of course, de Launay. The crowd is baying for his blood. But they are unaware of the promise made to him by Pierre-Augustin Hulin, the laundry owner who, a few hours earlier, took command of the French guards. He gave his word to the governor that he would get him to the competent authorities at the Hôtel de Ville unharmed. Fortunately, it is fairly close, a 20-minute walk. But for de Launay, those minutes would be the longest of his life. The crowd is in a frenzy. There is no way Hulin can keep his promise.
And they pounced on him. There was a kind of wave of collective emotion.
5:30 p.m. The governor is beaten, insulted, again and again. The mob chants death to de Launay. They want his head. Félix-François Desnos, a local butcher, brings it to them after decapitating de Launay with a knife.
Why did he kill de Launay? Because he heard he would become a hero. It was a rumor, and that's why he did it. He didn't even know de Launay.
The horror did not end there. That very evening, the triumphant mob paraded de Launay's severed head on a spike through the streets of Paris.
All of these acts were fairly common in the most violent riots during the ancient regime. This was how the monarchy behaved when it dispensed justice, when it displayed bodies, when it dismembered them, when it displayed them for ages in a public place. The rioters do the same thing, but obviously here it's the people, to make it clear that the people had meted out their justice. It's a revolution. It's as violent as the old regime was.
A regime which on the evening of July 14th was truly in jeopardy. The news of the storming of the Bastille hit Versailles like a bombshell. Isolated, Louis XVI had lost all authority.
He turns to Broglie, who is the commander of the troops, and says, you know, can we rely on the soldiers? And Broglie says, no, you can't rely on the soldiers. Now, you know, if a government cannot rely on ultimate force, then it's gone.
On the 14th of July, those in power realized that repression was no longer possible. The events were a wake-up call. In other words, this was when they lost control of the situation completely.
The king would have to make concessions to the country's new political authorities. So just 3 days after the fall of the Bastille, he decided to meet them at the Hôtel de Ville.
He arrives at the Hôtel de Ville, at this insurrectional city council. He is warmly welcomed, so he is still the great king, the good king.
That day, in a prudent gesture of conciliation, Louis XVI even agreed to wear the famous blue and red revolutionary cockade that was handed to him.
The king is recognizing that he has been successfully defied, and he's accepting defeat, in a sense. I mean, all this comes together as a sort of symbolic moment, the final loss of authority by the absolute monarchy to a more popular representative form of government.
The storming of the Bastille, which claimed the lives of some 100 attackers and 6 defenders, sent shockwaves around France and Europe. It marked the end of the absolute monarchy and the beginning of the French Revolution. And with it, heads rolled. Three and a half years after the Bastille fell, Louis XVI was tried, sentenced to death, and guillotined. His wife, Marie Antoinette, met the same fate. Camille Desmoulins, the defiant, young, stuttering lawyer, preached revolt in the name of democracy, becoming one of the leading figures in the French Revolution. But his opposition to the excesses of the Reign of Terror led to his being guillotined in 1794. As for the fortress, it had an astonishing fate. On the very evening of the 14th of July, its demolition began.
The demolition of the Bastille took longer, but it's at least as important as its storming, because it effectively removed the very symbol of the ancient regime from Paris's cityscape. It's as if it vanished.
But before it vanished, the Bastille became a fashionable spot. Bourgeois women even came to be locked up in the cells so they could boast about it afterwards.
It became a tourist attraction. People would visit the cells. They visited at night to scare themselves. It was a place for social outings, because there was this mythology of mystery and suffering, and it was all the more thrilling after the 14th of July 1789, because the people had triumphed.
As for the Bastille's thousands of cubic meters of stone, people took them just as they did fragments of the Berlin Wall 200 years later, in 1989.
As soon as the wall fell, it was destroyed and demolished by the people who were there. Many of them felt the need to take pieces of the wall with them, as souvenirs, as a reminder that they had been there that day. But maybe also because these pieces of wall symbolized newfound freedom.
The prison then became a commodity. All sorts of mementos and souvenirs were sold at extortionate prices. Miniature Bastilles, pictures, medallions, coins. Thus, the patriotic myth of the Bastille swiftly took hold and grew until it became the symbol of freedom wrested from the hands of the privileged by the people of Paris. Today, the building has gone. All that remains are a few stones in the Paris metro and around the Place de la Bastille. The 14th of July, Bastille Day, has become France's most important national holiday. Every year for the past 140 years, through military parades, public dances, and fireworks, France has celebrated national unity and freedom. That day, when the Parisians rebelled, left an indelible mark on the history of France and its capital. It also represents the end of a system and the birth of French democracy.